Loretta did not slow down. Her motorcycle cut across the wet bridge, red taillight flashing through the rain, and Jae Hwan followed too fast. Then her back tire slipped. Metal screamed against the pavement. Sparks tore across the bridge. Loretta hit the road hard, his father's helmet rolling away under the streetlight. Jae Hwan ran to her. He reached for her shoulder, but before his fingers could lift her, Loretta caught his wrist. Hard. "You start with your hands," she said. "You lose the truth." He froze. His father had warned him from the grave. Do not touch Loretta Vale, because before that night was over, he would learn the truth was not hidden in a vault. It was not buried in his father's grave. It was written on her skin. Three hours earlier, at a private auction, the first piece of that truth was locked behind glass.
The glass shattered before the auctioneer's hammer could fall. Jae Hwan's hand punched through the display case and closed around the yellowed envelope inside. Broken glass cut his knuckles. Blood ran over his fingers and stained the old paper. Chairs scraped back. No one reached for him. The auctioneer, "Mr. Jae Hwan." Jae Hwan opened the envelope before anyone dared stop him. At the top of the letter, in fading black ink, were 4 words. "For my son." His father had been dead 20 years. No one had told him this letter existed. He unfolded the paper. The first line hit harder than the glass. "If my son finds Loretta Vale, tell him he has no right to touch what I failed to protect." Jae Hwan read the name twice. Loretta Vale. He did not know her, but his father had written about her like a warning, like a sin he never confessed. Then a woman, softly. Jae Hwan turned. At the far end of the auction room stood a woman in a long black leather coat, silver hair, red lipstick, one gloved hand resting on a motorcycle helmet. His father's helmet, the one his mother said had burned in the crash. Loretta Vale was 72. She did not hide it. She carried her age like a blade. Jae Hwan folded the letter, blood marking the crease. Loretta Vale. She looked at the broken glass, then at his hand. "Your father said you would break something before you learned how to ask." A few men shifted in their seats. Jae Hwan stepped toward her. His guards moved with him. Loretta lifted one gloved hand. "Not them." The command was quiet. That made it worse. A 72-year-old woman had just given an order to the most feared man in Seoul. Everyone watched to see if he would obey. One of his men looked away first. Jae Hwan raised 2 fingers. His guards stopped. Loretta's mouth curved. "So he did leave you some manners." His jaw hardened. "What were you to my father?" "The part of his life your mother buried." The words cut through the room. Jae Hwan looked at the helmet. "That belongs to my family." "No," Loretta said. "Your family kept what belonged to me." She lifted the helmet and turned toward the service exit. Jae Hwan reached for her. It was instinct. Control before thought. Possession before permission. Loretta caught his wrist before his fingers touched her sleeve. His blood marked her glove. The room froze again. Her eyes did not soften. "You read the first line," she said. "Did you understand it?" Jae Hwan said nothing. Loretta released him. "You have no right to touch me." The sentence landed louder than the breaking glass. He was close enough to reach her, old enough to know better, young enough to want anyway. He hated that he wanted to step closer. Loretta adjusted the helmet against her side. Her coat shifted near her collarbone. For 1 second, he saw ink. 3 words beneath her skin. The same slant, the same pressure, the same handwriting as the letter. His father's handwriting. Jae Hwan's voice dropped. What is written on you? Loretta's face changed. Not fear, warning. Do not look at me like I am evidence. He looked at the letter in his hand, then at her throat. Is the rest of it on your body? She stepped closer, close enough for his men to misunderstand, close enough for the whole room to feel the scandal, still far enough that he could not touch her. The part your father was too ashamed to put on paper, she said. Then she walked toward the service exit. No explanation, no apology, no fear. At the service exit, she stopped without turning around. If you want the rest of the letter, follow without your guards. Then Loretta Vale disappeared with his father's helmet. Jae Hwan stood bleeding in the broken glass. For the first time in his life, the truth was not in his hand. It was on her skin. The service exit slammed open, and Loretta Vale walked out with his father's helmet. Jae Hwan followed before the door could swing shut. Loretta! She did not stop. At the bottom of the concrete ramp, a black motorcycle waited beneath the garage lights. Old steel, polished chrome, built to survive impact. Loretta walked straight to it. Jae Hwan's voice hardened. I asked you a question. No, she said. You demanded an answer. His guards spilled into the garage behind him. Black cars waited with engines running. Men in dark suits moved toward the exits. One command from him, and every door would close. Loretta looked at the cars, then at him. Still traveling with witnesses? Jae Hwan tightened his grip on the letter. You have my father's helmet. And you have his first honest sentence. He stepped closer. Not enough to touch, enough to make every guard watch. What did he do to you? Loretta's eyes dropped to the blood drying on his hand. Wrong question. She placed the helmet on the motorcycle seat and looked up at the security camera above them. Tell your men to stand down. Jae Hwan stared at her. Why would I do that? Because if one of them touches my bike, I burn the second line before sunrise. His guards stopped moving. Loretta lifted the helmet slowly. Then she put it on. The sight hit him harder than it should have. His father's helmet, on her head, like the past had chosen her over him. He remembered the ink beneath her collarbone and hated that the helmet was not the only thing she carried from his father. One of his guards glanced away. Jae Hwan saw it. So did Loretta. At 72, she still made the garage wait on her. There it is, she said through the visor. The shame. Not because I'm dangerous, because I'm old. His jaw locked. No one here is laughing. Not out loud. She swung one leg over the motorcycle. Jae Hwan moved before thinking. Loretta raised one gloved hand. He stopped, a full step away. His men watched their boss wait for permission from a woman they had been ready to stop. You learn quickly when men are watching, she said. I don't need witnesses to stop you. No, you need witnesses to pretend you still can. The words cut deep enough to silence the garage. Jae Hwan lowered his voice. You don't leave with my father's helmet. Loretta leaned over the handlebars. Then take it. The challenge hung between them. Helmet, letter, skin, truth. He could order his men forward. He could drag her off the bike. He could take the helmet, the answers, the proof, and lose whatever was written on her body forever. Loretta waited. She was not daring him to be violent. She was daring him not to be. Jae Hwan raised one hand. His guards stopped moving. Loretta tilted her helmeted head. Better. The garage gate began to lower. She started the motorcycle. The headlights slammed white across the gate. Jae Hwan turned to his men. "Stop the gate!" They ran. Too late. Loretta shot forward. The motorcycle slipped under the closing gate with inches to spare, her leather coat snapping behind her, his father's helmet disappearing into the Seoul night. Jae Hwan stood still for half a second, not like a boss, like a man who had just watched a 72-year-old woman ride away with his bloodline in her hands. Then his phone buzzed. Unknown number. If you bring guards, you lose the second line. Jae Hwan looked toward the street. Loretta's taillight cut between buses, taxis, and rain-slicked lanes. She was not running like prey. She was leading him. His driver opened the car door. "Sir?" Jae Hwan looked at the black sedan, then at the motorcycle parked beside the wall. Again, his men watched him obey her. He took the motorcycle keys. The letter burned in his pocket. Loretta was ahead of him, wearing both the helmet and the truth. He started the bike and tore into the street. Ahead, her taillight cut hard toward the wet bridge curve. She did not slow down.
Loretta did not slow down. Her taillight cut hard toward the wet bridge curve, red against black rain, and Jae Hwan leaned lower over his motorcycle. "Loretta!" The wind tore her name away. Her back tire slipped. Then the bike went sideways. Metal screamed against pavement. Sparks tore across the bridge. Loretta hit the road hard and rolled once toward the concrete barrier, his father's helmet striking the asphalt before stopping under a streetlight. Jae Hwan braked too hard. His motorcycle skidded. He threw it down and ran. "Loretta!" She was on her side, one gloved hand pressed to the pavement, breathing through pain she refused to give a sound. Rain slid over her leather coat. The shoulder seam had split open. Headlights slowed behind them. Someone shouted from a taxi. Jae Hwan dropped beside her. He saw blood. Not much. Enough to make him forget every rule. He reached for her shoulder to lift her. Loretta's hand snapped up and caught his wrist. Hard. Her grip hurt. He hated that he noticed how steady it was. "You start with your hands," she said, voice low from the fall. "You lose the truth." Jae Hwan froze. Rain ran down his face. "I was trying to help you." "No," she said. "You were trying to take control because fear gave you permission." The words cut sharper than the crash. He looked at his hand in her grip, his bloody knuckles from the auction, her rain-dark glove around his wrist. His father's letter between them, like a wound neither of them could close. Slowly, he pulled his hand back. Not because he wanted to, because she told him to. Loretta watched the choice happen. Her breathing was uneven, but her eyes stayed clear. "Stand up," she said. "You're hurt." "I know what I am." "Your shoulder." "Stand up, Jae Hwan." His name in her mouth stopped him more completely than the crash. He stood. Everything in him wanted to lift her anyway, but he did not. Loretta pushed herself up on one elbow. Pain flashed across her face and vanished almost as quickly. The torn leather shifted again. Jae Hwan saw skin. Only a narrow place near her shoulder, exposed where the coat had split. And there, beneath rain and blood, were 3 tattooed words. Not decorative, not random, written in the same pressure, the same slant, the same old hand as the letter in his coat, his father's handwriting. I failed her. Jae Hwan forgot the rain. The 3 words opened something in him he had spent 20 years keeping locked. Loretta saw him read it. Her face hardened. Look away. He did not. Not fast enough. Jae Hwan. That time her voice carried warning. He forced his eyes back to hers. But it was too late. The paper in his coat was only the beginning. His father had not only written to him, he had written on her. Jae Hwan swallowed. The letter continues on your body. Loretta rose slowly, refusing the hand he did not offer this time. Rain slid down her face like tears, though he knew better. No, she said. She picked up his father's helmet from the road. The letter survived on my body. A siren wailed somewhere below the bridge. His guards would come soon. His world would come soon. Orders, cars, weapons, control. Loretta looked toward the far end of the bridge. You get one question before they arrive. Jae Hwan's voice was barely controlled. Why did he write that? Loretta put the helmet under her arm. Wrong question again. She stepped past him, limping but still first. Behind her, the wrecked motorcycle bled oil into the rain. Jae Hwan followed without touching her. For the first time that night, it felt harder than violence. Loretta stopped beside the twisted bike and looked back. If the truth is on a woman's body, she said, what kind of man thinks pain gives him the right to read it? Jae Hwan had no answer. She turned toward the shadows beneath the bridge. Next time, you read from a mirror. Then she walked into the rain, carrying his father's helmet, his father's shame, and the part of the truth he had no right to touch. Stand close, she said without looking back. Don't reach, or lose me. The garage door shut behind them like a verdict. Hands behind your back, Loretta said. Jae Hwan turned. She stood beside a workbench with his father's helmet under one arm, rain on her silver hair, torn leather clinging to one shoulder. He looked at the room only after he heard the lock slide into place. Mirrors lined the concrete walls. A yellow line cut across the floor. A black leather belt rested on the workbench. No witnesses. Just Loretta, the helmet, the mirrors, and the part of his father's letter he had no right to read directly. Jae Hwan's voice was low. You brought me here for rules. No, she said. I brought you here because you keep failing them. She pointed to the yellow line. Stand there. He looked down at it, then at her. The line, Jae Hwan. He stepped onto it. Loretta placed the helmet on the workbench, beside the belt. His eyes dropped to the leather. She saw the reaction. Not for pain, she said. For memory. Then she turned slightly, letting the mirror catch the side of her face and the torn shoulder of her coat. First rule, hands behind your back. His jaw hardened. She waited until the silence made him choose. Somewhere outside, a siren faded into the distance. Water dripped from his coat onto the concrete. His bloody knuckles pulsed from the auction glass. Slowly, Jae Hwan put his hands behind his back. His fingers curled until the cuts opened again. Loretta watched the blood return. Second rule, she said.
You look only through the mirror. His eyes lifted. Not directly at you? Not directly at what you have not earned. The words hit low. He looked into the mirror. There she was, 72, rain-soaked, hurt, still more untouchable than any woman he had ever wanted. The mirror made it worse. It gave him her shape without giving him permission. Loretta's hand rested beside the belt. Third rule, you do not move when I move. He said nothing. Fourth, you get 2 questions, not 3. Why? That is 1. His eyes snapped to hers in the reflection. Loretta did not smile. Careful? He hated how fast she made his power useless. He hated more that part of him wanted to stay inside her rules long enough to learn the truth. She reached for the torn edge of her coat. Jae Hwan's breath changed. Loretta stopped. Say it. His voice came out rough. I do not touch. Again, I do not touch. And if you forget, I lose the truth. Only then did she lower the torn leather from her shoulder. Not far, not enough for ownership, enough for the mirror. The ink appeared in the reflection like a second voice, a narrow line along her upper back, written in the same pressure, the same slant, the same old hand as the letter in his coat. Jae Hwan forced himself to read only through the glass. A date, October 3rd. His body went cold. The report said his father died on October 4th. Her skin said October 3rd. Jae Hwan stepped forward before he knew he had moved. Loretta's hand landed on the belt, not grabbing it, only touching it. He stopped 1 inch before the yellow line. She looked at him through the mirror. That was almost your last mistake. His breath thinned. That date is wrong. No, she said. The report was. October 3rd, the night before the crash, the night before his mother wore black, the night before his father became a portrait. What happened that night? Loretta's eyes held his in the mirror. That is your second question. He froze. She let him feel the cost of wasting a question. Then she said, and you are not ready for the answer. A sound came from behind the garage door, a footstep, then another. Jae Hwan turned his head. Loretta did not. On the security monitor, one of his guards stood outside the locked door, speaking into a phone. Another appeared beside him, then a third. The camera saw Jae Hwan before they did. Seoul's most feared man, standing on a painted line with his hands behind his back, waiting for a 72-year-old woman to let him look. The guards saw through the narrow window. One guard raised his phone, then thought better of it. Jae Hwan's face hardened. Loretta watched him in the mirror. There it is again, she said. The part you fear more than truth. What? Being seen wanting a woman the world says should no longer be wanted. The words hit harder because the guards were still outside, because she was right, because he did not know whether he hated the shame or the fact that he wanted her anyway. Loretta pulled the torn leather back over her shoulder. Access ended. The mirror held only her face now. You saw the date, she said. That is all the access you earned tonight. Jae Hwan looked at the locked door.
Then at the guards outside, then back at her reflection.
Tell them to leave.
No, Loretta said. You tell them. He understood the test too late. Not power, humiliation. Not secrecy, choice. Jae Hwan walked to the garage door, hands still behind his back. His guards stared through the glass. He did not explain. He did not threaten. He only said, "Leave." They hesitated. Loretta watched from the mirror. Jae Hwan's voice dropped colder. "Now." The guards disappeared. When he turned back, Loretta was already holding his father's helmet. "You protected the room," she said. "Not me." He stood still. That small difference felt like a wound. Loretta walked toward the rear exit. "Next time, you return what your family kept. In public." "The helmet?" She looked back. "The helmet is only the object." He said nothing. "No," Loretta said. "The shame." She opened the rear door. "And you will do it where your men can watch." Then she disappeared, leaving him on the yellow line, hands behind his back, staring at a mirror that no longer gave him access.
The helmet sat in the center of Jae Hwan's club, like a challenge no man wanted to name. His father's helmet, Loretta's proof. Around it, Jae Hwan's men stood in a silent half-circle, pretending they were not waiting to see if their boss would obey a 72-year-old woman again. Jae Hwan stood at the head of the room in a black suit, the yellowed letter folded inside his breast pocket. His knuckles were bandaged. The cuts still ached when he flexed his hand. One of his men, "Boss, we can send it to her." Jae Hwan looked at him. The man went silent. Another tried. "Or say it was recovered. No need for all this." The elevator opened before Jae Hwan could answer. Loretta Vale stepped out before the doors had finished parting. Black leather coat, silver hair, red lipstick. One shoulder still stiff from the crash. She walked like pain had asked permission and been denied. Every man in the room turned. Some looked at her age. The smarter ones looked away. "She's old enough to be his mother," one of the younger men muttered. Loretta stopped. Jae Hwan's eyes cut toward the man, but Loretta answered first. "And still too much woman for him to handle." Silence hit the club like a slap. Loretta walked to the center table and looked down at the helmet. "You brought witnesses," she said. Jae Hwan's voice stayed controlled. "You asked for them." "I asked for witnesses, not cowards hiding behind whispers." The young man lowered his eyes. Loretta looked back at Jae Hwan. "Return it like property, and you leave with nothing. Return it like shame, and I give you the next line." The room tightened. Now every man understood the price. Jae Hwan wanted the next piece of the letter. He wanted the truth about his father. He wanted the answer hidden under Loretta's skin. But first he had to admit that the helmet was never his. He picked it up. Every man watched him choose between family pride and her truth. He stepped toward her. Loretta did not reach. She made him cross the distance. That was the cruelty. He held the helmet out. His voice carried across the club. "This is a transaction." Loretta looked at the helmet, then at his bandaged hand, then at the men behind him. "No," she said. "That is the word men use when obedience embarrasses them." A few men dropped their eyes. Loretta took one step closer, not enough to touch him, enough to make the room feel the scandal again. "A deal," she said, "is what men call obedience when a woman gives the order." Jae Hwan's hand stayed extended. Loretta still did not take the helmet. "Ask," she said. His eyes sharpened.
The room shifted. Someone near the bar, too loudly. "You want me to ask for permission to give you what is yours?" "No, I want you to admit it was never yours." Jae Hwan's hand tightened around the helmet. At the family. At the mother whose version of the crash was starting to rot. At the father who wrote on her skin. At the son who still thought objects proved ownership. Jae Hwan looked at the helmet again. He did not only want the next line, he wanted her approval. And that was worse. Slowly, he lowered his head. Not far, not deeply. Enough for the room to see the line break. "This belonged to you," he said. Loretta's eyes stayed on him. Louder. A muscle moved in his jaw. He wanted to refuse. He wanted to remind every man in the room that one word from him could end their breathing. Instead, he looked at his men. This belonged to her. No one moved. Loretta finally took the helmet, but she did not give him relief. She turned it in her hands, tracing one old scratch near the visor. "Your father made that mark the night he came to me bleeding." Jae Hwan went still. "What night?" Loretta lifted her eyes. "You already used your questions." His mouth tightened. "You said if I returned it, I would get the next piece." "And you did." She reached into the inside pocket of her coat and removed a small folded strip of paper. Not old, new, written in black ink. Jae Hwan took it. The words were short. "Your mother knew where he went before the crash." The word mother turned the room colder. Loretta put the helmet under her arm. "There's your next piece." "That is not enough." "It never is for men who confuse access with ownership." His hand lifted half an inch before he remembered the bridge, before he remembered the mirror, before he remembered what touching cost. He stopped. The entire room saw it. That was worse than shouting. "Loretta, good," she said. "You remembered." One of his younger men looked away, ashamed for him. Another, something under his breath. Loretta turned toward the room.
"You think I'm too old to make him weak." No one answered. She lifted the helmet slightly. "You should be more worried that I'm old enough to know where every weakness came from." Then she walked toward the elevator. Jae Hwan followed with his eyes, not his hands. At the doors, Loretta stopped. "You want the next mark?" He said nothing. "The next mark is not on paper," Loretta said, "and I am not the only one who knows where to find it." Jae Hwan's eyes narrowed. "Who?" At the elevator, she looked back. "Ask Victor Kane." The doors began to close. "And bring no men who think shame is louder than truth." The doors sealed. Jae Hwan stood before his people with the new line of the letter in his hand, his father's helmet gone, and a name he had never heard spoken with that kind of power. Victor Kane. For the first time, his men did not fear what he might do. They watched to see whether Jae Hwan would chase the woman, or the old man who knew her name first.
But Victor Kane was only the beginning. He knew why Loretta carried the truth on her body. He knew what Jae Hwan's father had done, and he knew what Jae Hwan's mother had buried before Seoul ever learned to mourn. The next part of Loretta's story does not end with a helmet. It leads to a funeral, a leaked photo, a final line of tattooed truth, an archive sealed for 20 years, a second letter from the dead, and the one answer Jae Hwan wanted most. Whether telling the truth could ever earn him the right to touch the woman he was already treating like evidence. Watch the full long version in the pinned comment.